Hello, my name's Linda Johnson. I'm Chief Executive for Homestart Central Bedfordshire. Homestart is a child and family support charity that's been supporting parents through the joys and the challenges of bringing up children for the last 35 years. So welcome to this tutorial on the teenage brain, whether you're the parent or the grandparent of a teenager or just getting prepared for the time when your child hits the teenage years. We're all individuals and so are our children, so some will sail through these years, but others will find it difficult. And like a lot of things to do with parenting, what might work for one child won't work with another. But the purpose of this talk is to provide some understanding about what's going on in the brain of a teenager so that we can understand some of their behaviour, and then this will help us with the way that we parent. It can be confusing to parents that the child that used to say that you were the best mummy in the world doesn't even want to walk on the same side of the road as you, and that everything you say seems to be embarrassing. So why is that? Is it hormones, or just the need to break free from parents and become independent? Well, both these things are true, but also new research shows that something special is going on in the teenager's brain. These changes in the brain start at around the age of 11 and don't end until about the age of 24. So let's start with some information about the brain. Well, it's incredible. It can fit into the palm of your hand. And did you know that there are more cells in one brain than there are people on the planet? The grey matter in the wrinkly outer part of the brain is mostly made up of neurons. These are nerve cells connected to each other by fibres, axons and dendrites that carry messages from one cell to another. These axons are mostly in the white matter part of the brain, which is underneath the grey matter. There's still an awful lot that we don't know about the brain, but advances in technology, particularly scanning, have helped us to discover an awful lot more. We used to think that the brain stopped developing at the end of childhood, but we've learned that there's major changes in the teenage years too. And apart from the first 3 years of life, the brain is more plastic in the teenage years than at any other stage of human development, so this gives chance for repair and rewiring. You can see on the slide 3 key areas of the brain that we're looking at today. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for thinking, planning, problem solving, self-control and awareness. The amygdala, concerned with emotion, sensation, arousal and response to fear. And lastly, the hippocampus, which has to do with memory. The 2 sites with the greatest change during this time are the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. More about this in a minute. So let's have a look at pruning of the nerve cells of the brain, the neurons. When a baby is born, it will have almost all of its neurons, but very few dendrites, the connectors between the cells. But these develop fast as the baby grows. These connections grow when the baby does something. So, for example, when it focuses on an object, the connections multiply and then strengthen in the parts of the brain which deal with seeing, the parts that deal with understanding what we see, and the parts that deal with remembering what we see. So it's not the number of neurons that we have that's important, but the number of and the strength of connections. More times we do something and repeat it, the more the connections increase and strengthen. So when we learn to drive a car, at the beginning it can feel really difficult and hard to remember what we're going to do, but eventually it becomes automatic, and that's to do with connections in our brain. The changes in the teenage brain start at around the age of 11 years old, when there's a large increase in the number of these connections. Then at about 16 or 17 years old, the connections not wanted are cut back, a bit like pruning a tree, leaving fewer branches, but these branches are thicker and stronger. The bridge between the 2 halves of the brain matures, which helps with the ability to think abstractly and to make connections between different ideas. This pruning starts at the back of the brain and works forward. And the last bit to be reached is the prefrontal cortex, which, as you remember, is the bit responsible for planning and reasoning. The hormone balance also is altered at this time. More about that later. Interestingly, some other mammals have a period of adolescence too, including monkeys, rats and mice, but they get through them quicker than humans do. The female rhesus monkey goes from puberty to adulthood between 18 months and 2 years old and displays similar characteristics to our teenagers, including sleep patterns, risk-taking and spending large amounts of time hanging about with other teenage monkeys. It can be hard parenting teenagers, and parents might wonder if they have any role to play in this. It's important to remember that it's just a stage and will end. So using the acronym STAGE, here are some helpful thoughts on surviving those years. S standing for significance, T for two-way communication, A for authority, G the generation gap, and E for emotion. S is for significance. Adults matter, although they often think they don't. It might not feel like this, especially if our teenager rejects what we're saying. However, we are just as important as we were when they were little. It's just a different role. It's all part of developing to try to be independent of adults. Young people often don't know what they want to be or who they are. What they do know is that they want to be different from their parents. And I can remember as a teenager thinking that when I was grown up, I'd act very differently to my parents. Now I'm a parent myself, my views have changed. It can be challenging and feel hurtful when a child doesn't think you know anything or are out of date. After all, when they were little, they thought you knew everything. Teenagers will reject your family values, saying they're their own person, but it's often only temporary. It's like breaking the apron strings, natural and healthy, but it is hard for parents. Teenagers are training adults, even though they may look like adults. And as parents, it can be helpful to see our role as training them for their future role as an adult, by offering the right levels of safety and protection, while also allowing them some independence and autonomy. This, of course, will depend on the actual risk and the capability of your child. You know your own child. And it will, of course, change as they grow older. We are role models, though it might not feel like that sometimes. But what we do and our attitudes do have an influence. Our values, for example, how we look after our own health, how we treat others, and how we work together as parents, whether we're parenting together or apart, all have an influence. T is for two-way communication. As the brain is changing, teenagers are developing their communication skills, even though sometimes it can feel like all we hear is grunting. A typical 14-year-old has only about 75% of the words of adults around them, and they often feel self-conscious and inarticulate, and they also need privacy, so it can lead to us seeing them as uncommunicative. However, they often are articulate and expressive, but they just haven't developed the capacity for small talk. They may also misinterpret the questions we ask them, where we're just trying to show an interest, such as how are you getting on with the homework, as being interrogated or told what to do. And this is another area where we can play a part as a role model, communicating the collected way to calm things down when they're feeling overwhelmed with their emotions and struggling to manage them. We might need sometimes to ask for a break when things get heated, and then suggest we come back together to talk when we both calm down. I found that talking that isn't eyeball to eyeball is less threatening to teenagers, and I've had good conversations in the car or washing up, anything that's mainly side by side. It's usually also best when it's at their time, when they want to speak, and that often seems to be late at night, or maybe when we're tired, but it is actually worth it on picking up on those times. A stands for authority in times of change. As I mentioned before, we're training our teenagers to be adults, gradually equipping them with more independence and autonomy according to their age and also their abilities. The old saying about giving them strong roots but also wings to fly really does apply. So we need to be warm and supportive but also have clear boundaries. I found that do's work better than don'ts, so being very clear about what behaviour you do want rather than saying what you don't want. So instead of saying, don't drop all your clothes on the floor, say, pick up your dirty clothes and put them in the washing basket. It's difficult to make teenagers do things without their buy-in, so do remember to give lots of praise. And it can sometimes mean picking our battles and not picking up on everything we feel our teenagers are doing wrong. Some things like messy bedrooms, personally, I think are just not worth the battle. It does seem to be a normal age and stage for most teenagers, and it does end. So unless you see cockroaches leaving their bedrooms with suitcases, I really wouldn't worry about a messy bedroom. G is the generation gap. No matter how young we think we are, our teenagers don't see us that way, and there is a generation gap. There is a difference from when we were teenagers and the world that they're in now. Being judged is a key issue for young people. They often get a bad press. If you look in the papers, it's usually about hoodies, drugs, and knife crime, whereas young people do an awful lot of good things that get overlooked. Teenagers can be idealistic, energetic, enthusiastic, to name just a few things. And no matter how young we think we are, we have had a very different experience. An example of this is the social world today, which really can't be compared to 30, 40 years ago. The internet, social media, life lived online, and it's ever changing from week to week. Another difference is that a significant number of children and young people stay in some sort of educational training now until at least the age of 18, more going on to university. And being in work is different from being in education. It can be helpful for us to think back to when we were teenagers, so that we can try and walk in their shoes a little. And a common cry from young people is that you don't understand, but we can ask at that point, well, help me to understand. Try and encourage them to talk about what they and their friends are doing. If you're not so sure about it, ask them if they think it's okay. Ask them what the pressures are without being judgmental. It can be so easy to say sometimes, well, you think that's hard, just wait until you've grown up, but it's really not very helpful. Adults need to be tellable when things go wrong. Ease for emotion. Ask any parent what teenagers are like, and they'll often say they're moody. I can remember as a teenager swinging through various emotions in just one day. The reason for this is the amygdala in the brain. That's the area that manages emotions, sensations, and arousal. This undergoes major changes in this time, and it does take time to settle down. The amygdala itself is very affected by hormone balance, which means that a young person can experience great swings from one mood to another, from 1 hour to another, with a kind of flip-flop of emotions going on. Combine that with the social and emotional changes from a child to an adult, and life can feel confusing and pressured and anxious and worrying. Adults obviously feel anxiety and worry too, but we do have the maturity to manage our emotions. Of course, it can be very stressful for parents too. I remember always loving my teenagers, but not always liking them. We might feel disappointed and sad that we don't have the same close relationship that we once had. Teenagers do need love as much as young children do, but they may need it expressed in other ways. And sometimes we just need to stand back and not take over, just be there. We may sometimes need just to take a deep breath and not react, just walk away. Remember what we were talking about earlier about just picking our battles. We can also feel very alone during this time, but talking to other parents can be helpful. We often don't get the opportunity to do it like we used to when they were little, when we used to see parents at the school gate. So we can feel like we're the only ones who only recognise our teenagers 50% of the time and are struggling with that. Someone described it that having a teenager is as if they're going off into space for a few years, but they do come back to land eventually. So try and keep a sense of humour and remember it will pass. After all, we were all teenagers once and we turned out okay. So let's talk about hormones. There are many hormones that influence brain function and therefore behaviour. And during adolescence, there's a major alteration in the hormone balance. A few examples of these hormones are cortisol, the anxiety hormone, the sex hormones, serotonin, the feel-good hormone, dopamine, the reward hormone, and melatonin, the hormone that affects sleep. There's a big change in hormone balance during adolescence, and these vary during the space of 24 hours, much more than they do for adults, which explains why moods and feelings can be so volatile. Most young people agree that life for them feels more stressful, more moody, and it's more difficult to get to sleep. And that leads us on to the topic of melatonin, the hormone that's responsible for sleep. You might ask, why does my teenager stay up late and I can't get him up in the morning? Or maybe on Saturday he sleeps until lunchtime and even then I have to wake him up. Well, there's actually a biological reason for that. The hormone melatonin prepares our brains to be sleepy, and around puberty it's produced much later in the day than it is when we're children. So teenagers often don't feel ready for bed, and they often don't feel ready till 2 hours later than adults. And then, of course, they're not ready to get up in the morning. The thing is that sleep is really important for learning and memory, and teenagers actually do need 8 to 10 hours. A lot aren't getting that. So as adults, we can help to encourage them to have good sleep. Ideas for this would be a regular sleep routine, avoid excitement like computer games before going to sleep, and importantly, switch off the phone, don't go online, because the blue light from electronic devices can hinder rest. Ideally, put phones outside the bedroom door. We might need to lead the way in that and have that as a family rule. It's another of those ways that we can be role models. And to help our young people with focusing on relaxing before bedtime, things like quiet music, reading, lavender, help the brain to switch off. Risk-taking. Some, but not all of our teenagers will take risks or do things without thinking. This is because the planning, thinking, problem-solving part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, is the area that develops last. It's not always bad taking risks. Sometimes we do need to take risks in order to grow. The hormone balance is a part to play in this, particularly dopamine. And also, of course, friends and the social circumstances our children are living in have a really big influence. As parents, we can support our young person to take healthy risks, such as through sports or travelling, and also to help them with managing risk too. Help them to plan ahead in order to mitigate risk. We could sit down with them to learn good decision making skills or role model this. For example, just talking through the pros and cons of a situation before making a decision. So we're coming to an end now. The last few slides summarise the changes that occur as a result of changes in the brain. There are good changes. Maturity in the brain leads to abstract thinking, better memory, greater vocabulary, scientific reasoning, and better communication skills. And the two halves of the brain connect better, so our teenager is able to use more parts of the brain. There are also not so good changes as well as a result of the brain development. The brain is in a state of upheaval, which can cause confusion and uncertainty, and our teenager has trouble knowing what to think or how to decide. The hormone balance is upset, leading to mood swings, irritability, and wanting to have fun, and keen to take risks that aren't always healthy. So as adults, what can we do to help our teenagers? The environment does matter, and we're a key element in that. There are some roles for us to try and show understanding. And I mentioned before, it's important to be able to be tellable when things do go wrong for our teenagers. To try and help our young people to manage the hormone balance. We talk, for example, about encouraging our young people to get enough sleep. And on the next slide, we'll talk about how our young people can beef up their prefrontal cortexes in order to help. We can try and help them with good routines. What can our young people do themselves? So there are things that they can do to do this thing called beefing up their prefrontal cortexes. In other words, to get it moving faster, get the changes moving faster. To be proactive in the use of media. To think about, what is the media actually saying? Is it true? Is it fake news? To be curious. To practice decision-making skills. And it's also really important to be active, get more oxygen to the brain, and it's good for anxiety and worry. Well, I've come to the end now. I hope you found it helpful. I'd really like to say thank you, big thank you to Family Links, especially Dr. John Coleman, to Central Bedfordshire Council, and mostly to you for listening.